For more on the West Australian border battle, I'm joined live now by Labor MP Patrick Gorman and Liberal MP Jason Falinski. Thank you both for your time. Let's go to you, Patrick Gorman, first, being the West Australian out there in Perth. Do you think the border should stay up?
Well, I think the Prime Minister and his West Australian Liberal colleagues are seriously out of touch with Western Australians on this. It has been a successful policy. I 100% support Mark McGowan's view that this is in Western Australia's interests and indeed in the national interest. It's enabled our mining companies to stay strong throughout this crisis. It has enabled Western Australia to help Victoria. They are literally flying swabs from Victoria over to WA, testing them to help keep Victorians safe. So it is not in the national interest to tear down this border, and I am disappointed, as are pretty much every West Australian I speak to, about the federal government's view that they will go and assist Mr Palmer in this High Court case. It is hard to justify, and it has made Western Australians incredibly angry.
Jason Falinski, one of the really hard-hit sectors at the moment has been all those FIFO workers trying to go into WA to keep the economy going, and then they get stuck in some pretty dire situations, including some of them having to self-isolate. Do you think it is fair for WA to keep the border up when it's costing so much to so many people?
Look, I think the Prime Minister's view is not this is the view of the federal government. It's our view that this is what the High Court is likely to find, and we live in a country that is based on the rule of law, not the rule of man, or any individual for that matter. And I think the issue has always been from the beginning that Mark McGowan's stand on this has been very popular in Western Australia. There is no doubt that a lot of people like it, but the problem that you continue to have is that it's not based on health evidence. So it may be possible to say we're going to close the border to certain hotspots where there have been outbreaks of COVID-19, but just to arbitrarily close the border to all other states and territories, regardless of the health outcomes that they're having, is not really a justifiable position for him to take. And I don't want to point the finger, I don't want to bring politics into this, but at the end of the day, you know, we can have great health outcomes, but we do know that if people don't have a sense of economic hope and opportunity, of financial security, then that also has an impact on their mental health. And it's very important that we're not just looking at what is a popular policy today, but what will have an impact on our economy as we move forward. A lot of these states are able to make these decisions at the moment because the Commonwealth Government is picking up the tab through JobKeeper and JobSeeker. But when those policies begin tapering off, I'm very worried about the impact on individuals' financial circumstances.
Patrick Gorman, that's an interesting point. WA was already feeling the pinch with the mining sector downturn, and then this on top of everything else. Do you think that there is a mental health cost to the border staying up that's not being considered?
Well, I think there are also, you've got to look at both sides of this. There'll also be a mental health cost if the border is taken down and Western Australians have genuine fears about the health of them, their friends and family. I wouldn't want to see what happens when Clive Palmer is the first person to bounce across the West Australian border. The reception he would get would be, he'd be lucky if it was just frosty. People are very angry about this High Court challenge. And on the point of the economy, Western Australia has some of the most relaxed restrictions for businesses of any state in the country. It has actually enabled our economy to continue to recover from this crisis quicker. And again, that's a good thing for the national economy. It means our mining companies are paying tax. It means that cafes are less likely to be reliant on JobKeeper come September, October, November, December. So Western Australia is doing its bit for the national economy, and this is the best way that Western Australia can contribute. And I just want to see a bit more cooperation. I don't want to see more op-ed pieces from Matthias Cormann lecturing Mark McGowan in the newspaper. I think a bit of cooperation rather than just kind of like Scott Morrison, Clive Palmer, Mark McGowan fight it out in the High Court thing. You know, it's not what Australians want to see, and it's definitely not what West Australians want to see.
That's an interesting point you raise about the politicisation of it, and we did just have Ken Wyatt on WA MP as well, saying that he actually supports the border staying up as well. So it does show that it's not a case of universal agreement.
It's split in cabinet.
I'll leave that. But interesting point you raised, though, Jason Falinsky, about you're saying that WA is not necessarily relying on the health advice. This is the same argument being raised with Queensland now that they've decided to designate Sydney a hotspot. Do you think that the Queensland government's politicising this as well?
Look, Annalise, I'm inclined to say yes, but once again, I don't want to politicise this. I mean, we could be back here in 3 months' time saying, well, doesn't the decision of the Premier of Queensland in retrospect look like a very good one? So it's very easy for me to sit in a television studio and opine on whether this is a good idea or not. But what we can do is rely on the best advice that we have now. And the advice says that it might be understandable for the Premier of Queensland to say, look, you know, there are parts of Sydney that if you've been to in the last 14 days, you will need to isolate if you come into Queensland. But to close the entire border to the state of New South Wales seems like somewhat of a massive overreaction. I understand that it's popular. I understand that it looks like you're taking a very strong leadership stand when you do it. But I just, urge people to think about 3-6 months down the track when JobKeeper and JobSeeker have started to taper off. So the federal government is not picking up the bill for these businesses, and the business just simply isn't there because what looked like a good idea today was actually a terrible idea 2 or 3 months down the track. I'm just urging people to think about this very carefully, especially if you're a Premier. And I think the point that Gladys Berejiklian made today, which was, look, Queensland benefits from people from New South Wales taking holidays in Queensland. It's not to the benefit of New South Wales, is a good one. And I really would urge premiers to do the right thing and to rely on the health advice that they have rather than playing to potentially people's fears and concerns.
Patrick Gorman, do you agree?
Well, I think the argument around tourism is always about people saying, come to Sydney, come to Sydney. It's not about actually in interest of the national tourism market. I just think if you really want to lead by example, Jason, let's actually find the creative way to have Parliament sit. That, for me, I think is the thing that grates with a lot of ordinary Australians right now, is that you see politicians who could have the Parliament sitting next week are at the same time saying, we can't do Parliament, but we should definitely open the borders across the country. It just doesn't gel. There's not a consistency of approach from the government on this, and it doesn't quite sit right with me that we're sort of saying, we need to create jobs with the tourism sector when we're not really doing our own jobs in going to Parliament. I think if we can sort of lead by example, that would be my preference.
Yeah, Jason Falinsky, I do have to say, when you say that you're effectively locking out all of New South Wales by banning Sydney, about 2 million people live outside of the Sydney CBD. You're being a little Sydney-centric there, aren't you?
Sorry, I don't understand your question, Annalise. I'm saying that if the Queensland government said, look, there have been breakouts in parts of Sydney, and therefore if you've been to those parts, you need to isolate if you come into Queensland, that would make sense. But people to close the border to everyone in New South Wales, regardless of whether they may have been exposed to the virus, and the best health data we have now seems a bit perverse, is I suppose the best way I can put it. So I think I'm being the opposite of Sydney-centric.
I'm just being a proud West Australian wanting to fight against the Sydney-centric approach.
You should have made that declaration up front, Annalise.
I just want to see my mum, but that's fine. We will leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you both for your time on this really important topic.
Thank you, Annalise. Thanks, Pat.